Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Heads of Panel Root and Roots of Migration on Western Balkan in Mobilities and Reception. I'm Stefano De Giuberti, an Italian researcher at the National Research Council, and I'm very pleased to be here and coordinate this panel. First of all, I want to thank the organizer for inviting me and host our panel. And I wish to thank actually also the technician for the logistic support in this time of COVID. I'm delighted to welcome Roberta Altin, our moderator, and the four speakers. I'm just going to briefly introduce the theme of our panel, and I will I hand the floor to Roberta. The motivation, actually, to organize this panel developed from the increasing awareness that an international dialogue that aims at fostering the development of a truly open and inclusive societies through a stronger scientific networks among Central Eastern countries of Europe cannot avoid to address and reflect on the so-called migration crisis that happened actually in 2015 and is still ongoing, and after the official closure of the Balkan, the so-called Balkan route, made several changes within the Balkan area. The policy of border securitization have led several countries to become the external frontier of EU border regime, so a kind of migration buffer zone. And together with that, the control and containment of the transit movement have not only affected the migrant on the move, but more importantly, they triggered changes within the societies and the local population in Western Balkan. There are some journalistic investigation and report of voluntary association that try to shed light on this topic. However, even if the crisis is occurring just at the doorstep of EU, very little is known about the living situation of the migrant, and especially on the interaction that they have with the state apparatus, the regional and local public services, citizen, as everything is concerning the reception of them. So understanding this aspect appears particularly important in countries and among populations that have already experienced very recently process of internal and forced movement of people, as well as mass immigration during the last decade. So in other words, the complexity of these ongoing trajectories of migration along the Western Balkan route needs a better understanding, on our opinion, of their entanglement with the memories and experience of migration in the 90s. Together with a diachronic examination of the changes and evolution of this official state policies and practice on migration. And finally, an exploration and analysis of the roles and point of view of the multiple actors involved, not just the migrant. So some questions need to be addressed. What are the conditions of the migrants who are living in waiting, in provisional shelter or border crossing, in urban makeshift camps? What are the role of the political authorities at local, regional, national level, the role of NGO, voluntary association, and social workers, citizens, and in general local communities? And finally, to what extent are the response of Western Balkan society to forced migrants embedded in their history and past experience, in relation to their history and past experience of migration? So we think this is an avoidable question to be addressed. And in this perspective, the anthropological approach of our four speakers will try to enrich this discussion, exploring the relationship between mobility, history, and the agency of people, trying somehow to reconnect what is the history with the capital letter with the micro stories of people. And doing that, they will try to intertwine the past, present, and the new form of mobilities also in respect to the ongoing pandemic, COVID pandemic crisis. And they will do that through field research that they have carried out in several countries of Balkans, of Western Balkans, in particular in Hungary, Serbia, and Croatia. So just brief housekeeping notes just for this hybrid panel. Our aim is, of course, to foster discussion, and so, as we said, for everyone that is participating remotely, we will just ask to send questions. You can already send questions on the Q&A chat box, and together with the question that we collect with the participant in person, we will going to answer all the questions at the end of the panel, not after each presentation. And so, as I said, I'm very pleased to host our 4 online speakers, and I will give just a few words about their curriculum and the topics of their presentation, and after I will hand over to Roberta. So first of all, we will have Céline Quentin, that is a research fellow at the Center of International Studies in Paris, and she was before a Marie Curie fellow at the Central European University in Budapest. And Céline is going to talk about the social construction of contemporary migration crisis in Hungary and how pro-migrant solidarity initiatives resist the exclusionary practice promoted by political spectacularization of migration. And then we will hear about Marta Stoch-Mitrovic, that is research associate at the Institute of Ethnography of the Serbian Academy of Science in Serbia. And Marta is going to talk about the anti-migration rhetoric that in Serbia and how the changing topography of the Balkan route. She's going to talk about the changing topography in the Balkan route in the light of regional and local development, and especially in relation to the inclusion of the country in the EU border regime and with the recent spread of the pandemic. After, we will have Drago Zuparic, and he is research associate and assistant professor actually of sociology of migration at the University of Zagreb. And Drago is going to talk on the Europeanization of migration and borders in Croatia. And he will look at the role of migration management technologies and how actually the period of the Balkan corridor, and its aftermath, have impacted on the Croatian society and how actually this Croatian society think about mobilities. And finally, we are going to hear Jelena Tozic, that is assistant professor for transcultural studies at the University of St. Gallen and lecturer in Vienna. Jelena is going to talk about how the refugee crisis and the ongoing COVID pandemic inform populism and anti-migration politics in Serbia, producing ambivalent social representation of working migrants as well as forced migrants. So they will going to have around 15 minutes each, and I'm very happy to hand over the discussion to Roberta, that is going to steer our panel. Thanks a lot.
Many thanks, Stefano. And just a few words to complete your really thick introduction. I will try very briefly to explain the reason of this panel at ESOF 2020 in Trieste by recalling some key concepts of our proposal that will be discussed by the speaker in this panel. After March 2016, which means the official closure of the so-called Balkan route as a passage over land toward the European Union, Western Balkans and Eastern European countries became a buffer zones for a high number of migrants that got stuck in transit, initially in Serbia and more recently in Bosnia, Croatia, and other countries. So Trieste and the northeastern border of Italy constitutes for migrants one of the most important gateways to Europe, with the secularization of the border areas and an ambivalent pushback and/or hospitality policy that occur also in other nations involved in this route. This is one of the reasons why we have called to speak together researchers working and often living in this context, so close to us, but with too little scientific dialogue and network. It is important to underline that this implies not only geographical factors, but also temporal, partly because the migrants are pushed back through a kind of forced stuckness in between these stations, where they are obliged to become invisible for long periods, and partly because this latter migratory process intersects with their underlying layers of mobility in the Balkans, arousing an entanglement of previous refugee flows, border and forced displacement, as happens in Trieste and in this region too. The ethnographic and diachronic perspective of this panel on the recent migration in the Balkans sets a more complex interpretative standpoint to go beyond the understanding of the so-called refugee crisis in order to explore its constructive, changing dimension through past, present, and future. Also considering the emergency period due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the re-emergence of the border and fences between nations. By ensuring a broad geographic coverage of the topic, the speaker will provide an enriching contribution to the current scientific debate on migration on Western Balkans, offering a new insights on the everyday social configuration of multiple spatial, temporal, and social interconnections that will emerge as the analysis of the street-level practices of public apparatus, civil society, divided between solidarity and populism and new populism, and the stories of migrants, with their experience of mobility, immobility, and stasi shaped by power relation as well by the temporalities of the mobility. After underlining some principal key points of the scientific debates, I don't steal any more time and give the floor to our speaker. So the first to speak will be Céline Quentin. So please, Céline, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Yeah? Okay, well, thanks a lot to the organizers, to the panelists, to those people who still managed to attend. So the paper I'm going to present today is based on fieldwork I conducted when I was, as Stefano said, living in Budapest and working at the Central European University, so pretty much between 2016 and 19. And I was actually supposed to spend the summer in Hungary and to sort of conduct further fieldwork, but this was not possible for quite obvious reasons. And the focus of my research during those years was on the emergence and structuration and then criminalization of various initiatives in support of refugees and migrants, of displaced people in the country. And as was already said, this period was marked by a discourse of migration crisis. So a lot of important critiques have been put to that notion, but it was still a very structuring factor that shaped both governmental engagement with migration and also solidarity or civil society responses. So it's important to retain that, that context in spite of the important weaknesses perhaps of the, or the different layers of instrumentalization of the concept of crisis that we could critique. So in this short presentation, what I try to do is to sketch out a set of responses to migration that unfolded in Hungary, because a lot of attention has been paid for important reasons to the securitization and criminalization of migration in the country, which indeed has taken extreme proportion to the extent we cannot really speak of a functional asylum system in the country today, for instance. But besides this spectacular marginalization and exclusion of migrants, there were also other sets of responses and politics, and I'll try to address two further such sets. The first one, I call it the politics of neglect or negligence, and those are somehow more discrete measures of deterrence and of marginalization targeting displaced people, which I think aim at making lives unlivable, but also at making social connection and socialities between those deemed desirable residents and zone perceived as undesirable migrants impossible. And then the second or third set of politics I'll address, so against this sort of hostile and brutalizing context, will be politics of solidarity that managed to emerge in the country in spite of circumstances. So because time is quite short, I will only give brief features or examples, but I hope we can further reflect together on those connections and perhaps how this sits within the overall context of the Balkan route. So I don't have a very fleshed out PowerPoint, but I wanted to show you a map that features some of the key sites which I mentioned in the presentation. So you see two arrows at the bottom, one on the left, which shows the city of Peć, one as a border with Croatia, or close to the border with Croatia, and one close to the city of Szeged at the Serbian border. And it shows in particular the Roske transit zone, which I will mention in the presentation. And then you also see a red dot on the left of the capital city, Budapest. And this is just to indicate a detention facility that I will mention in the presentation, the Bishke camp. So this is just to briefly give you an idea of the sort of geography. This is actually an IOM map that shows various detention facilities in Hungary in 2018. So the paper on which I base this presentation starts with a vignette that sort of narrates my first visit to the Rescue Transit Zone, so the arrow on the right on the screen, in 2016. And I'll show you a photo of that zone. As you can see, it's a highly securitized barbed wire site that sits on the recently constructed fence between Hungary and Serbia, so the fence that was built by Hungarian authority in 2015. And this is what the fence looks like. So these transit zones, there are several of them, actually two functional ones, are essentially meant to filter people's access to Hungarian territory. And in fact, various decrees as of 2015 have made those transit zones the only possible entry point for people into Hungary, so that if people manage to enter the country from another means, they would be either placed into detention or sent back to this transit zone. And that's one example amongst other of this dismantlement of the Hungarian asylum system, which I mentioned. But what I wanted to sort of express in the vignette about this first visit to the Roske transit zone, when I met local activists in the nearby city of Szeged, and we drove to that point, was the sort of spectacularization of that site of the border. And the drive was very evocative in that sense, because we would go through very quiet rural landscapes of fields and forests, and suddenly, almost surrealistically, the militarized fence stood in front of us. And what you don't see in the photos, because it's actually not allowed to take pictures of those, are that the fence is actually guarded and is made performant and efficient through the presence of army and of police, which are located every few dozens of meters. So I thought this sort of image was evocative of the geographical separation, but also somehow of the temporal ones, because it's important to situate the discourse of migration crisis in Hungarian politics as something that very much emerged in 2015 and that very quickly took a centrality and an importance that's very impressive. So for instance, the crime or the legal offense of illegal border crossing was actually introduced in Hungarian legislation in 2015. So it is a sort of turning point, but what I'll try to show in this presentation is that it's also connected to other processes which have been unfolding in the country since the 1990s about delineating sort of legitimate national public through the othering of a number of social groups. So you know, as I tried to show with those images, since 2015, we've witnessed a whole series of measures, of practices, of images that have made the borders of the country, but also their protection by the state, manifested through fences, through the army, ultra visible. And these zones and the border fence are, in that sense, only two examples in a much larger set of dispositives that have reproduced and spectacularized and showcased that idea of a migration crisis and a migrant threat. So you probably have heard of the anti-migrant billboard campaign that started in Hungary in 2015, of which I show a couple of examples. There were several of them on different occasions. This one was, for instance, a poster that was displayed around the country in the campaign leading up to a referendum in 2016, in October 2016, about the proposed European Commission refugee distribution quota. So by the time I moved to Budapest more permanently in March 2016, any bus stops, metro station, newspaper ads were pretty much occupied by this kind of visual and discursive propaganda. There were also a series of what was called the national consultation on migration. So those took the form of questionnaires that were distributed to virtually all Hungarian households and were supposedly consulting the population on issues to do with migration, but those were obviously framed in a very leading way. So, for instance, there was a national consultation on the link between migration and terrorism, or such framing. And of course, a number of legislative transformation took place, so laws ordering the systematic detention of asylum seekers, and laws criminalizing or imposing heavy taxation, so disqualifying in various ways pretty much all form of support and aid to asylum seekers in the country. So all those practices have participated in this construction of a certain figure of the migrant threat, and that works both from within the country, but also, and that's how perhaps also it links importantly to what we will hear in the other presentation. Even if people are not arriving in high numbers, they are lurking behind the borders, and the whole Balkan route is sort of filled with those dangerous migrants which are about to enter Hungary should the state sort of lower its guards. Of course, this discourse is congenial, is instrumental to a certain type of politics promoted by leading party Fidesz and its strongman Prime Minister Viktor Orban, so a type of ultra-nationalist but also very neoliberal politics that focuses and is premised on the othering of a certain number of social groups. Because whilst these dispositives have participated in this politics of spectacle, so sort of hyper-visibilize the migrant threat, they also sort of dialectically reframe the boundary of the legitimate national public. So they sort of reshaped the Hungarian nation and who has a legitimate right to belonging, to presence, to care, and to state protection in a way. So it's important to see that at the same time as it produces otherness, it also sort of coalesces an homogenized idea of the Hungarian nation. And I think it's important to think about it in this term because it helps seeing that this othering and racialization we saw as of 2015 targeting migrants actually has its roots in longer term processes which have taken as targets other groups. Of course, most prominently Roma citizens of Hungary, but also a number of social groups which have been deemed as unproductive or as undesirable in the post-1999 moral economies of Hungary. And those connections have been made by solidarity actors, and I will come back to those later. But I think that a number of individuals and groups do not fit neatly into this revamped idea of the nation, and therefore the exclusionary politics that we've discussed so much in relation to migration in Hungary should be thought in a sort of broader social and political frame. So I'll just move on to this second set of politics, which I've described as politics of negligence, and I'll try to be a bit short. But what I'm trying to say essentially, and I'm sure it's not that original and it takes place elsewhere, is that there is always an other side to the spectacle of the migrant threat and border protection. And in the Hungarian case, this other side has been a series of discrete measures that have not been spectacularized, that have not been discussed very much in political terms, and which constitute actions of destitution, of precarization, of neglect, and of silencing of migrants who are indeed in the country. And I think they are less visible, but they stand in continuity or as the sort of shadowy underside of the spectacle of migration I just discussed. And I think one of their aim is precisely, and as was mentioned by Stefano in the introduction to the panel, to sever or to impede meaningful social connection between migrants, at least those perceived as such by, or categorized as such by Hungarian authorities, and those seen as the legitimate residents and sort of users of public space and of the country. And that's why I put this red dot on Bishke, because I think it's an evocative example. Bishke was one of the reception centers that was opened in the 1990s, so one of the longest standing camp. And although there were local tension, it was reasonably inserted in the local fabric, and it was also closely located to the city of Budapest, where a lot of the sort of NGO activities or educational activities for displaced people would take place. And in 2016, the Hungarian government decided to close Bishke camps. They displaced almost overnight people from that center to tents and containers very close to the Austrian, so the western borders of the country. And that was not made into a political spectacle. It was actually done really discreetly. But what it did is, of course, interrupt a number of developing socialities and submit people to extreme physical hardship, because it was, you know, a very harsh Hungarian winter, and people were living in tents by minus 20 degrees. So those are sort of less obvious forms of violence, but which are obviously have very important effects. And other such measures, such as curtailing social support for migrants and refugees whilst preventing them from working, or in fact even depriving people from food through their asylum appeal, which is something you might also have heard about, which are not at all put forward by the government or the authorities, but which act as deterrents and as a means to make lives pretty much unlivable, and were spoken about when they are very much in administrative terms or in bureaucratic terms, and sort of depoliticized in that sense, but stand together with the kind of politics of spectacle I discussed before.
Sorry, Celine, may I ask you to go toward the conclusion, because we don't have enough time in order to give other space for the other speakers.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Well, maybe I'll just wrap up then very shortly, trying to just contrast what I call the politics of solidarity with those two sets of sort of marginalizing process against migrants. So I conducted field work for several months in Pécs and Szeged with informal initiatives that were sort of spontaneously created on the ground by a group of peoples. As of 2015, those networks were called Mixol Pécs and Mixol Szeged. And the way they've been described in the literature, which is already quite limited on Hungarian migration solidarity, is very much as solely charitable or humanitarian initiatives or actions, which is also a discourse that was somehow reproduced and defended by the sort of core groups or spokesperson of those people. And where I'd like to say that an ethnographic investigation that considers longer-term structural and historical factors, and that looks at individual biographies in connection to social evolution in the country. What I'd like to say is importantly shown by such an ethnography is that longer-term in-depth discussions and with those people showed that what they were making were precisely those connections I was trying to describe. By which I mean they were making the connection between the segregation and marginalization experienced by newly arrived displaced people and longer-term social, political, and economic processes of destitution that had targeted a number of domestic groups, such as Roma people, the unemployed, the elderly, people with disability, and a whole range of groups that have been framed as unproductive and therefore undeserving in a sort of new capitalist moral economy of neoliberal Hungary. And in that sense, I think to sort of tease out those connections, and I don't want to obviously sound over-optimistic because the situation is very dire in Hungary, it does, however, indicate or points to alternative visions of social and political links in the country, which are under very severe conditions, but sort of give hope that a situated politics of solidarity could grow into something more consciously developed as a political alternative. Okay, I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Celine. And now we'll pass over the discussion to Marta. Thanks a lot.
We'll talk about a Serbian path into the integration into the European border regime. The policy of externalization of the EU migration control to non-EU states is not a new phenomenon. In fact, this program has existed for more than 2 decades. For example, in strategy paper on immigration and asylum policy from 1998, is offered a distinctive image of the desired engagement of all states in Europe, Asia, and Africa in protecting unwanted migration toward the EU. In Article 60 of this document, a model of concentric circles of migration policy could replace that of Fortress Europe. For obvious reasons, the Schengen states currently lay down the most intensive control measures. Their neighbors, essentially the associated states and perhaps also the Mediterranean area, should gradually be linked into a similar system which could be brought increasingly into line with the first circle standards, particularly with regard to visa, border control, and readmission policies. A third circle of states, Turkey and North Africa, will then concentrate primarily on transit checks and combating facilitated networks, and fourth circle, Middle East, China, and Black Africa, in eliminating push factors. Further, in Article 61 of this document, it is said, in this system as a whole, meeting the obligations arising in each respective role should have positive consequences for the country concerned. For example, the second circle must meet Schengen standards as a precondition for EU membership. For the third circle, intensified economic cooperation is linked to the fulfillment of their obligations, and the fourth circle, the extent of development aid granted, can be accessed on that basis. First, the concept and policy decision of using surrounding states to protect the core of the EU from unwanted migration was not directly articulated out of fear of anti-colonial and anti-elitist debates, but stayed in the background of numerous developmental projects, trade treaties, security deals, etc. For example, as Hayes and Vermeulen noticed, the Austrian strategy paper was widely condemned by migrant and refugee organizations and disowned by the EU, but the principles it contained were embodied in 2002 EU Action Plan on Illegal Immigration. Further, some authors avoid the concept of externalization itself, as it implied asymmetrical power positions of the parties involved. Instead of the term externalization of borders, they tend to choose external dimension of the EU policy, since it conceals this asymmetry by assigning the emphasis on cooperation of the EU with regional non-EU partners. Beneath those euphemisms lie the interest of the European imperial and neo-colonial attempts to filter the flow of migrants by imposing operations of security and control to the territories from which the migrants come or pass through. Borderscape is a useful concept that has already been employed to describe the process of externalization of the EU borders. The term borderscape emphasizes plural, dynamic, relational, contested, and deterritorialized aspects of socio-spatial agencies of ordering and exclusion that evade nation-state territorialities. Borderscapes are spaces of interaction between state and capital, and a place of complex tensions that produce institutionalization and deinstitutionalization of borders. The EU has been transposing its borders throughout the European continent, Africa, Asia. One of those inside Europe borderscapes has been formed within the territory of so-called Western Balkans. The role of the Western Balkans as one of the EU borderscapes is to protect the EU core countries from unwanted migrants. It is produced as a complex transnational, processual, deterritorial, and dispossessed space. In order to explain how the Western Balkan has been constructed as the external borderscape of the EU, I will describe historical and socio-political genealogies of the Western Balkans, including the position of Serbia within these processes. The term Balkan itself is contested. Todorova argues that the Balkan has been seen as anti-civilization, alter ego, the dark side within Europe. This half-imaginary, half-real space of the Western Balkans has been conceptualized from the outside as inner outskirt of the EU, the shady area outside Schengen zone and European Union. It is the place whose nationals seek asylum in the European Union in vain, since the recognition rate for nationals of the Western Balkan states is the lowest, and they still comprise significant proportion of asylum seekers in the EU member states. It is also perceived as an incubator of workforce for deficitary professions in the EU. In search for lower costs of production, especially lower wages, European industries are being exported to Western Balkan states. Western Balkan states have been characterized as having fragile economies, high unemployment rate, corruption, weak institutions, questionable rule of law, and diminishing political rights and civil liberties. Austerity measures imposed by the International Monetary Fund following the commonly named 2008 financial crisis forbade additional employment in the public sector without approval of special governmental commissions and led to further deterioration of the already extremely vulnerable sector of civil services. Due to the persistent economic and political problems, Western Balkan states are mostly states of emigration. The European Union executes what is designated as a regional approach in regard to the Western Balkan states, which began as a conflict management strategy following hostilities embedded in nationalist paradigms that unfolded throughout the 1990s and which extend to present times. After the Thessaloniki summit in 2003, this regional approach firmly included the alleged European future for the Western Balkan states. That is, the prospect to finally become members of the EU, the concrete realization of which would be financially and in other ways supported by the EU. As a consequence, states had to maintain good mutual relations, build statehoods based on the rule of law, and after positive evaluation by the EU, begin with the implementation of concrete legislative and institutional changes within their territories. Among the first goals was to remove these states from the so-called Black Schengen list, that is, to abolish visa regime for the citizens of the Western Balkan states. In order to achieve that, states had to adopt migration policies complementary to those existing in the EU. That implied introducing the asylum system based on the Geneva Convention and illegal migration combat strategies with corresponding institutions, concepts, technologies, and practices which did not exist before this, at least not in the same form. The baseline of these changes was to impose control of movement of Western Balkans and third state nationals toward the EU member states, for which the states received financial and other support from the EU directly or through the NGO sector. Except Croatia from 2013, Western Balkan states are not members of the European Union, but are in different stages of the EU accession process, which demands that the non-EU states involved transform their legislative and institutional arrangements in line with the EU administration. This also implies that these states have been, to various degrees, integrating into the EU administrative system for migration control, cooperating with European institutions for migration management, as well accessing European funds dedicated to these matters. However, the differences between the Western Balkan states are becoming muted over time as they become part of the expansive European border regime. Similarly, all are in subordinate relation to the EU, with very limited possibilities to negotiate the terms of the accession. The asymmetric political and economic positioning between Western Balkan states and the EU is prevailing. This asymmetry is, for instance, exemplified in the negotiations between European Border and Coast Guard Agency, former Frontex, with Serbia and North Macedonia, where the EU proposed that members of the Frontex team shall enjoy immunity from administrative, civil, and criminal jurisdiction of the Republic of Serbia, for example. The structural asymmetries among the Western Balkan states outweighed any differences, which mostly concern temporal aspects of the negotiation process: how many chapters a state managed to open, how many agreements to sign, and more local neuralgic issues: relationship between Serbia and Kosovo, issue of the entities in Bosnia and Herzegovina, question of Albanian-speaking citizens of Northern Macedonia, etc., as well as changing physical features of the migration movements. Serbia began to implement EU-centered migration policy as a part of the change of political course following the 2000 overthrow of Slobodan Milosevic's regime. Before this, Serbia and Yugoslavia did recognize asylum and refugee status, but in a specific manner. They were both closely related to protection from political persecution and therefore, in practice, granted to political allies. The 1990s wars of Yugoslav succession brought hundreds of thousands of people from other Yugoslav republics to Serbia, and the word refugee became associated with this particular migration. On the other hand, Serbia and Yugoslavia did not recognize a specific migration type that is now often framed as irregular migration in politically saturated discourse, whether in its securitarian or humanitarian form. Until the start of the EU accession process, Serbian authorities knew about the offense of illegal border crossing, but did not have a specific administrative rubric that would apply to a whole category of people with very specific and often highly derogatory connotations attached to it. At the external borders of the EU, the only citizenship that counts is the citizenship of the EU member states. External borderscapes are institutionalized to prevent unwanted migrants from reaching this goal. The asylum system in Serbia, as part of its citizenship regime, is one of the ways borders have been enforced in particular ways to regulate border crossing and access to the EU. The discourse concerning asylum and irregular migration, with all its concepts and institutions, techniques, and code of conduct, was introduced in Serbia through the EU accession process. As a prerequisite for visa liberalization with the EU in 2009, Serbia signed readmission agreements with the EU and its member states and adopted the law on asylum and the alien law. In several national documents, such as, for example, Strategy for Integrated Border Management of 2006 or Strategy for Combating Illegal Migration 2009 to 2014, control of migration toward the EU has explicitly been stated. Citizens of Serbia were promised facilitated access into the area of freedom, security, and justice. Only the strict control of the crossing of Serbian borders was established, and if the Serbian state obliged itself to readmit all its citizens staying without permissions in the EU, as well as third countries' nationals who are not allowed to enter a state in the EU, this access was granted. Facilitating entry into the EU for some is contingent on preventing others from moving freely, and readmission obligations for those who manage to cross despite all. In that way, the EU transferred the control of crossing its external borders to the institutions of a state which itself is not an EU member state, while the EU kept its supervisory role in this process. Moreover, to enable this enterprise running smoothly, the EU provided necessary aid in trainings, human resources, finances, and technical means. Conceptually, administratively, and functionally, the EU accession process established Serbia as a buffer zone. Until the summer of migration, Serbia's position within the external borderscape was still largely perceived as concerning its own nationals, whose movement it had to control and whose migration to the EU it had to prevent. In the summer 2015, different people came in focus of the restrictive migration policy, those escaping wars and poverty from the countries south and east of Europe. The external borderscape is not a stabilized space, but a dynamic one constantly in flux. It has been defined and redefined in historical processes of social institutionalization. Even though Serbia established its asylum system in 2008, it has never become fully operational. The Asylum Office has granted refugee status to only 100 and a little bit more people from the time of its establishment until nowadays. Besides the proverbial malfunctioning of the relevant national institutions, the majority of asylum procedures have been suspended because the applicants simply left the territory of Serbia. The length of stay in Serbia varies drastically, depending on the period of year, current state of the permeability of borders, as well as the individual health and financial situations of migrants. The stay is always the consequence of inability to continue the journey toward the intended destination state. When Serbia officially became a part of the European border regime in 2008, the physical features of the migration movements regarding above all the routes, length of stay, and availability of state-provided accommodation have changed drastically. Previously, the main migration route went from south and southeast to the north. These two routes intersected in Serbia's capital, Belgrade. When the Hungarian border became closed in September 2015, the route diverted westward to Croatia. From then until March 2016, the formalized corridor enabled fast and often state-supported transportation from the border between Greece and Northern Macedonia across Serbia, Croatia, and Slovenia to Austria.
Sorry, Marta, for the interruption. May you try to summarize toward the conclusion?
Yeah. In Serbia, the differences between entrance and exit borders are erased since all borders are being crossed in all directions in the attempt to avoid being stuck and to keep alive the hope of reaching final destination. People are moving from Serbia to Bosnia and back, from Serbia to Greece, from Serbia to Romania and back. So as a result of cross borders, the number of cross-border migration movement in the region is doubling. There has also been an extreme proliferation of routes throughout the region. People manage, for example, to almost reach Trieste and then are apprehended by police, pushed back to Slovenia, then to Croatia, then to Bosnia. On the other side, the EU border regime increases cross-border mobilities. We can see that. On another, it increases border control and even results in the establishment of new borders. For example, between entities in Bosnia and Herzegovina or between some parts in Serbia in different periods. The European border regime is thus creating new borders, increasing cross-border mobility and producing new forms of diaspora and vulnerabilities, but also jobs in securitarian and humanitarian industries in its wide borderscapes, which stretch across nation-state geopolitical areas. The crisis and emergency discourse enabled the imposition of extraordinary measures, accumulation of finances, and allocation of other resources. In impoverished Western Balkan states, the intake of money from the EU immigration emergency and post-emergency funds provided a source of income and thus some sort of economic stability for many people employed in both humanitarian as well border control domain. Circular transit is therefore the dominant form of migration movement in the region as people look for a way out. However, migrants are not the only ones circulating in the Western Balkans. Practices, discourses, knowledges, technologies, even particular narratives, organizations, and individual professionals are also following the changed topography. Frontex is signing new cooperation agreements with Western Balkan states. Border guards from different states have trainings together to learn from each other and to bring new equipment and manpower to existing units. Together with people, securitarian practices are circulating, ranging from learning how to directly prevent movement to developing and implementing various deterrence techniques. Forced mobility inside the borderscape goes hand in hand with discourses.
Sorry, Marta, we have only 1 minute.
Just one sentence, okay.
1 minute.
Goes hand in hand with so forced mobility of migrants within borderscape of Western Balkans goes hand in hand with discourses which identify Western Balkan states as transit states, giving legitimacy to approaches that treat migration as transit, emergency-like phenomenon, and instead of building a system that would enable any kind of long-term and substantial integration of migrants into local societies. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marta.
So thanks a lot, Marta. And we just pass over the floor to Drago Zuparilic. Good morning, Drago.
Hi, Drago.
Hi, good morning. Happy to be here. Hope you can hear me clear and loud and you can see the presentation. So thank you for the introduction. I'm a sociologist by the background, working at the Department of Sociology at the University of Zagreb, and we'll discuss a little bit about mobility in the post-Balkan corridor time, also reflecting on the Balkan corridor phase in Croatian part of this so-called Balkan migration route. So first of all, there's been lots of different basically researchers already published about migration, asylum and border policies in the Balkans, as well as the discourses which have become more securitized and more militarized in the period of the Balkan corridor and its aftermaths, while people on the move have been increasingly criminalized and irregularized in their statuses and perspectives. Marta already told you about the situation in Serbia. I guess one of the characteristics of the Croatian migration and asylum national and integration system is that it's lacking of institutional basically capacities and political will of the political elites to try to enforce more of the welcoming and more of the receptive policies in these societies. Basically, Croatia has undergone in the process of Europeanization of these different policies through the very long period of time from 2001 with the signing the agreement of joining the European Union up to 2013, almost 12 years. We dedicated to the fact of, let's say, also externalizing, but also internalizing this different regulation and boosting basically our legislative as well as our institutional capacities for the reception and the quality of protection. But I guess that the main contribution of the Croatian state was boosting the technical means of border control and surveillance in order to prepare us for the next step, for the future joining of the Schengen area. And basically, if we look at the Triandafido and Dimitriadi a description of three spaces of control, which means that on one hand you have externalized border in readmission and return agreements with the third countries, then at the same time you have this internalization of the border regime practices through the Schengen Area Code agreement and also through the work of Frontex. We heard about the Frontex missions being implemented nowadays in Serbia, North Macedonia, Kosovo, Montenegro, Bosnia and Herzegovina as the candidate countries for the European Union. So that is something that Croatia is basically has already gone through, and I guess it is the part of this process of the Europeanization and of gaining more and more control and surveillance technical means at our borders. Croatia, as well as other Balkan countries, is of course traditional immigration territory with very low share of foreign population. Less than 1% basically of the people in the country are foreigners, meaning that there's lack of ethnic communities and migrant networks, and that could be partly one of the explanation why so few of the basically even recognized refugees want to stay in Croatia. In the same time, the title of this panel is From Roots to Roads, which means that we can also reflect on the situation about the forced induced displacement in the Balkan wars in the 1990s. And I would say even though if Croatia had the experience of 500,000 of internal displaced persons of its own and 500,000 of those coming from Bosnia, also displacing and forcibly pushing 250,000 of Croatian Serbs, unfortunately, to Serbia. Still, I don't see that we utilize this sort of structural institutional memory of assisting displaced population, meaning of those who are coming as third country nationals, as migrants and refugees from African or Asian territory. being only basically fostered by this process of Europeanization and conditioned by the actually external EU conditioning. So when we discuss in Croatia about migration, basically nowadays even in the high political debates prior to parliamentary election or presidential election, mostly we've been dealing with the framing of migration as newly economically driven emigration of Croatian citizens from the country after the accession of the European Union, or we discuss about this more prevalent type of co-ethnic migration within ex-Yugoslav countries and territories. In the same time, very similar situation as in Serbia, basically from refugee-producing country in the 1990s, we have become a transiting country in the years of 2000, and timidly now we are becoming receiving state as well as, I would definitely agree with Mark, also kind of maybe buffer zone or buffer territory for enormous numbers of those who are getting stuck or stranded at borders of Bosnia, Croatia, and Serbia. So with very high cancellation rates, we also have very low recognition rates, basically. And the official narrative of the state is that a huge majority of those who apply for the status basically get into the cancellation of the procedure because they leave the territory before a decision, the first instance decision about their asylum claims. It was also visible during the corridor phase that during these 7 months of the so-called crisis, yeah, we should be definitely critical to that term, but only some few hundreds of people actually basically sought for the protection in the Croatian territory, meaning that almost all of them just continue venturing in this very organized transit of people towards Western European states. But the real question is, are we transient or transit state and society only by chance, because migrants want to reach Western Europe, or also by choice? I would say that we are part of this broken European refugee system, and we are definitely part of this new kind of European migration regime, also playing so-called the role of policemen for the European Union, trying to prevent and intercept people on our territory in order not to reach destination countries of their preference. So basically, migration trajectories, and it's based on some of our researches that we've done with the asylum seekers back then in 2015, doing the interviews and focus groups with many of them, that their migration trajectories and assessments are done within highly coercive opportunity structures. So basically, many of them, even if they applied for the asylum in Croatia, they saw themselves as a kind of stranded migrants who are stuck and nowadays especially pushed back from the borders and from the territory, even deep in the territory of the Croatia. Back then in 2015, we called them reluctant asylum seekers who would rather try to, venturing further and try to avoid or skip Croatia as a destination country. But one of the things is not only that they know that some of their compatriots or family members are somewhere else in Germany or Sweden or whatever, but that they are quite aware, it was really sensible in their interviews, quite aware about this lack of political will and shortcomings and systematic deficiencies of the asylum systems, not only in Croatia, but in all South and East European countries, which basically make them unattractive and partly inaccessible to refugees in the sense of the reception conditions, of the quality of the procedure, and especially of the quality of the protection. So in mobility practices by the state that happened basically within the Balkan corridor period started with the policies of humanitarianism. Once we called it opportunistic humanitarianism, which happened basically within this structure of mobile detention, as Hamershak and Plesha called it, which was kind of the controlled, organized, and state-assisted, but closed and securitized reception and transit through the corridor. So not by chance that you had the chance to, leave this mobile detention structure. Okay, there were a couple of cases, very individual cases, but basically it was really state controlled and securitized during that phase of especially the autumn of 2015. And then starting maybe from November 2015 already, we witnessed radical change towards securitization practices with the ethnical racial profiling of only eligible so-called CR refugees, Syrian, Iraqi, and Afghanistani, then later on only Syrians, deterrence measures, deflection, deportation, readmissions, forced returns, and especially collective and chain pushbacks even that happened even prior to the closure corridor. And nowadays we have detention and transit reception centers as well that are at the very outskirts of the borders with Serbia and with Bosnia and Herzegovina, also serving this function of the containments, right? And furthermore, also what we are witnessing in very different reports made by Amnesty International or Border Violence Monitoring Network is this kind of systemic violence towards migrants and that's the borders of Croatia, with borders with Slovenia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Serbia, with the state argumentation that basically what they're doing, they're defending borders for the European Union in order to become deserving the Schengen membership, EU membership in the case of Serbia and Bosnia, I guess. So access to territory and to refugee status determination procedure is obscured and restricted and is definitely breaching international and EU or common European asylum standards, but we see that European Union is struggling with, these different visions of how to come up with a new asylum and migration pact and how to have more human and I don't know, solidarity approach in these regards. In the same time, boosting and fostering means of control, deterrence, and containment. These are some of the quite vivid images from the borders with Bosnia and Serbia, and basically evidences of brutality of the Croatian police and violent acts against the migrants. And to go to the conclusion, now there is a legitimate question: is it a resettlement scheme, the new game, the new thing for Croatia? When Croatia is seen as the second best option in the light of recent demise of welcoming culture at the countries of the EU core. So we've done research in 2019 trying to figure out about the reception initial integration assistance for refugee families accommodated in local towns across Croatia. It is a new thing. We don't have that much of the experiences, but it was very interesting that we included voices of 26 already recognized refugees who clearly emphasize the fact that they don't see cultural barriers to their life to Croatia, but they think that this integration system is not well regulated with many contradictions. They are also recognized as the desirable workforce in most local communities, but especially in low-skilled professions and service sectors. So we do, because of the immigration, we do need immigrant labor force, but still, it's more in this very 3D jobs, so-called very precarious conditions and such alike. And but it is the thing that some of them are now seeing Croatia as a possible country where they can start new lives. And I guess this is the last slide, or the one before the last, that basically there is discursive shift to threatening subjects that is repeatedly dehumanized, rescaling deservedness. So those who are being resettled are the only who deserve the refugee protection, unlike those who stuck at the borders. There is also logic of false agency with the criminalization of the solidarity, accusing many of the pro-refugee activists like happen to be involved in smuggling, and fostering negative populist attitudes and not in my background logic of protection elsewhere. Because the main task is not to become a buffer zone or hotspot or even desired destination for the refugees and future migrants. And okay, this is just to connect it with the COVID times. What we have seen that pandemic crisis meant further securitization, containment, and lockdown. For example, the reception facilities for asylum seekers, which are supposed to be open type of the facilities, now are forcibly put into quarantines with the barbed wires, and they're making them. The state is making them in immobile zones and detainment facilities. Basically, at the moment, resettlement program is suspended because of the COVID, of the corona pandemic. And also what I don't have time to elaborate further, but you know, on this line that Celine was talking about, you know, we are also witnessing different kind of professionalization and institutionalization of the care services and new organizational forms of different solidarity actors. Those that started their work in the Balkan corridors phase as those who are already longer present in this field, and they're becoming membership of international networks from Izmir in Turkey, Chios, all the way to Calais, Jungle, and such like, making vibrant transnational so-called pro-refugee movements. So basically, but for others, it is a very valid question how to move from this reactive humanitarianism to more proactive hospitality, especially in more longer-term perspective of protection and integration. Thank you for bearing with me, and sorry if I was a little bit longer.
Thanks, Drago, for this very rich presentation in showing the complexity of migration patterns in Croatia. And now finally we welcome Jelena Tozic. Good morning, Jelena.
Okay, great, because my AirPods just crashed, so it's good that the audio works. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, thanks a lot for inviting me to this very interesting and topical panel, and I hope to build on, you know, the thoughts and insights that we've already heard, and especially on Marta's insights on the current situation in Serbia. What I basically want to do in my paper is to exactly what's one of the goals of the panel, to kind of see migration of the current, like the more recent phases of migration regimes in the Balkans from a historical and ethnographic perspective. And of course, to connect it with the issue of populism, right-wing populism. So that's basically what I'm going to try to do in the paper. As is widely known, the so-called refugee crisis has been a welcome and successfully used legitimacy resource for right-wing populism across Europe in consolidating, as we all know, anti-migrant, racist and Islamophobic discourses. And anthropologists have, as I will shortly talk about in a bit more detail, have recently been looking closer at how right-wing populist politics and of affect works primarily by creating simplified images of good or bad migrants, and in consequence, as we have also heard several times today, deserving or undeserving migrant populations. I think I should have this like this. Yeah. By using the example of Serbia, in this paper I will explore how representations of migrants are used and misused by populist politics. Recent history of migration in the region shows how forced migrants along the so-called Balkan route and work irregular migrants in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic can figure as a resource for populist politics in different and also contradicting ways, which is related to particular and historically embedded patterns and framings of migration. So I will argue that in the Western Balkans, the images of good, bad migrants tend to be somewhat less stable than in West European anti-migrant discourses. I will argue that they are more ambivalent in particular ways, which is grounded on legacies and changing patterns of migration, which are crucial for the region. And I'll focus on work migration and forced migration. Firstly, the image of the, so speaking on work migration, the image of the diligent work migrants loyal to nationalist politics can easily turn into one of irresponsible and threatening subjects. I will argue that one of the reasons for this might be an ambivalent image of the work migrant, which is based in the particular history and transformation of emigration from former Yugoslavia to Western Europe and its interrelation with nationalist populism. Secondly, I will argue that the usage of the image of the Muslim migrant in Serbia in the so-called context of the so-called Balkan route seems to be in a way more flexible and variable, due again to particular history and presence of Muslim populations in the region. So the Muslim migrant can thus more easily at the same time appear as the subject of legitimate humanitarian aid and freedom of movement, as well as the threatening Muslim other. My paper has 3 parts. I will first briefly discuss the notion and phenomenon of populism in general and in Serbia in particular. Secondly, I will explore, so to say, the populist variations of exploiting the issue of forced and work migrants in contemporary Serbia by zooming in on the so-called refugee crisis and the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, and I will then offer some conclusions. The topic of populism opens up a very broad, historically embedded theoretical space. In terms of a heuristic understanding of populism, I find the proposal by political scientists Made and Rovira Kaltwasser from 2017 very useful, namely to see populism in the sense of a theme-centered ideology, a set of ideas that are related to very different and often even incompatible ideological contents. What the various types of populism have in common, however, is the claim that politics is the expression of the will of the people, the common people, and of course always in contrast or in opposition to elites, intellectuals, and especially of relevance for me today, migrants or foreigners. The currently very vibrant anthropological focus on right-wing populism is characterized by intensive ethnographic field research and a critical self-reflection. And I would here definitely agree with anthropologist Agnieszka Pasieka's call, as she frames it, to take right-wing populist claims seriously and literally, and to engage with these arguments ethnographically. Anthropologists have also focused, and this is especially important for me today, on the differences between populisms in Western Europe and Eastern European post-socialist contexts, in which anti-migrant Islamophobic and racist components emerge as vibrant in particular historically embedded ways. For example, Don Cobb's work on the so-called working class populism in Poland, Chris Hunt's theorization of the so-called, as he calls it, agrarian populism in Hungary, or Teodora Veta's work on Serbia, as I will come back to shortly, are examples in this regard. But a crucial argument these authors share, and an argument I really agree with, is that Eastern Europe or the Western Balkans are not more populist or, populist in a less modern way. Rather, populism across Europe is grounded in the conjuncture of neoliberalism, post-politics, and the claims of the disenfranchised working class or peasant populations, for example. And it is along these lines that Teodora Veta explains the rise of the Serbian Radical Party, an ultranationalist populist party in Serbia in the 2000s, when she concludes that the success of the Radical Party is, I quote, lies in a rather rational political choice of its supporters, for whom, for different reasons, the Serbian Radical Party represented the only political option that they could actually identify with, in the absence of a politically and institutionally organized left, end of quote. I would apply the same kind of argument to the current populist regime in Serbia by saying that it is not necessarily because of the actual ideological content, which is contradictory and scarce, in comparison to constant narcissistic media presence by the president, Aleksandar Vučić, but primarily for the lack of other options due to the loss of legitimacy of the scattered so-called pro-democratic forces. So that's the basis that the regime can claim, even though partly faked, but still considerable support in the population. But what are the most recent populist quasi-takes on migration in Serbia? What role does migration play in populist politics and power legitimation? Here we need to look into the recent history of populism in Serbia. In terms of migration, the populist regimes of Milosevic, so until 1999, and Vučić since 2012, had different situations to, in a way, manage and exploit politically. Populism during Milosevic first used the Serbian population in other parts of Yugoslavia, for example, refugees from Croatia, for his nationalist discourse, and then subjected it to harsh forms of othering, neglect, and resettlement, when those people ended up as forced migrants in Serbia. Furthermore, the classical Serbian work migrants and wealthy emigrants were seen primarily as a financial and ideological backup. Even a ministry for diaspora existed, while the young and by and large anti-nationalist emigrants were framed in the typical populist foreign collaborator manner, so world conspiracy theories. Apart from quasi-inheriting this ambivalence in representing migrants, Vučić's populism has to come up with ways to politically exploit two radically new situations, namely the so-called refugee crisis and the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Let me first look at the COVID-19 pandemic and its populist exploitation in Serbia. Soon after Vučić and his medical advisors uttered a bunch of jokes about, as they said, most ridiculous virus in history at a press conference in early March this year, the regime in Serbia drastically changed the tone as the number of COVID-19 cases in Serbia was rising. More interestingly, immediately a surprising culprit for the corona crisis in Serbia was identified, and it was the diaspora. Vučić's accusation of the diaspora started in his typical plea tone. On a press conference on March 14th, he urged, I quote, people who live and work outside of the homeland not to come home because this would be the end of us, end of quote. End of March, after presenting the alleged number of returnees being over 300,000, he went as far as accusing them for not only importing the virus by coming back, not respecting the epidemiological measures, but even of coming back to Serbia, as he framed it, to get free medical treatment. But who was Vučić actually blaming? As often discussed with my friends and relatives across Europe, as we were all trapped in our home offices, he could have hardly meant us, the privileged ones, in the sense of being work migrants or second-generation migrants who regularly work and live abroad with citizenship or a long-term visa. Why would someone who has a medical insurance, for example, in Austria, go back to Serbia to get free medical treatment in a country which is medically, unfortunately, much less equipped? Also precisely because of the debunking of the social and medical system through post-socialist neoliberal reforms and the ongoing huge brain drain of medical and care workers. Rather, Vučić's accusation of the diaspora would only make sense, which makes the populist scapegoat discourse about migrants only worse, in terms of the thousands of irregular migrants who navigate the Schengen regime to be able to survive and support their families in present-day Serbia. It is those women and men who are precarious and irregular workers and indeed do not have a medical insurance abroad, and who legitimately rushed back to their home country in which, if not being able to have a decent life, they at least have a right to have a medical treatment. However, it was this migrant population the populist regime seek to address as the elections in May were approaching. One could then observe how the image of the diaspora and the official management of the corona crisis in Serbia radically transformed, according to the aim to ensure votes by citizens living abroad. And these had to be those citizens who do not have a citizenship of a Western European country, but are precarious and commuting workers. Yeah, I'll stop here with this example and then move to my second and last example, the so-called refugee crisis and how this was managed and exploited by the populist politics. As I have written elsewhere in more detail, the populist exploitation of the refugee crisis by the regime, by and large, did not, and this is a crucial point, mobilize classic and historically embedded Islamophobic images and arguments. Rather, the Vučić regime used the image of migrants without any close reference to their gender, religious, or ethnic affiliation and the reasons for their forced mobility for positive self-presentation in Serbia and internationally. So, for example, firstly, Vučić did not get tired of stressing the fact that Serbia did not close its borders and did not employ violence at the border by contrasting Serbia with some EU countries, such as Hungary or Croatia. So he used this line of argumentation to frame the image of Serbia as actual or even superior Europe in terms of not limiting the right to movement, humanitarian aid, and non-discriminatory, non-Islamophobic discourse. Actually, I would argue here that the image of the Muslim migrant, which is crucial in populist discourses in Western Europe, is not so easy to exploit in the post-Yugoslav context, in this case, the one of Serbia. Due to the Ottoman legacy and related present-day Muslim minorities, as well as the legacy of educational migration from the Middle East and Africa during the non-aligned Yugoslav times, the image of the Muslim migrant has to be treated more delicately. Moreover, unlike in Western European populism, being non-Islamophobic proves to be an excellent populist strategy in Serbia. So this is a crucial difference I would suggest. Secondly, and related to the previous point, the refugee crisis was used in terms of the regime's implicit representation of the Muslim minorities in Serbia. My favorite example, you can see here in the middle in the photo, is the one of portraying local police forces in South Serbia, a region featuring an Albanian Muslim majority population and a multi-ethnic police project, as the Balkan roots, heroes with the gentle heart. At one moment, namely, Serbian newspapers and websites in the summer 2015 were quasi flooded by the image of a policeman gently holding a baby boy. Recep Arifi became the hero of the Balkan route and was even given an award for humanity by the Serbian Minister of Interior. However, the fact that he was not awarded also as a member of the Muslim Albanian minority, but merely as a Serbian policeman, sparked a wave of criticisms and exemplifies the populist ambivalence towards the image of the internal Muslim as it played out in the course of the so-called refugee crisis. And finally, the anti-Islamophobic image of the regime's populist strategy also served and still serves to demarcate itself towards ultra-right-wing parties such as Dveri and groups such as Leviathan. As mobility along the so-called Balkan route continued after its official closure and people on the move were stranded in different parts of Serbia, often supported by the state, by the citizens and the civil society, certain political actors increasingly started using an anti-migrant and Islamophobic tone in their critique of the government. In a classic populist conspiracy theory manner, Dveri's leader Duško Obradović, probably the most vocal anti-migrant voice in party politics in Serbia, regularly criticizes Vučić's open border and pro-Muslim migration politics, as he says, a la Soros and a la Merkel. Certain extreme right-wing groups went a step further and even entered refugee camps while protesting against the presence of Muslim migrants in Serbia. I quote the young gentleman on the right. I don't want my girlfriend to be attacked by migrants. I don't want my army and my people to secure migrants. I don't want to give over Orthodox Christianity to Muslims, yelled Filip, a young male member of the movement Leviathan, while he was filming his break into the refugee camp in the Serbian town of Obrenovac on May 6th this year, where he was then arrested by the police. So the internal right-wing populist dynamic shows how the image of the Muslim male migrants, so this is also very gendered, is used in different ways or not used at all in order to acquire political capital. The critical reactions to right-wing anti-migrant and Islamophobic rhetorics well serve the regime to strengthen its above-mentioned image of the superior European humanitarian, non-nationalist and non-Islamophobic actor. And this is exemplified in the following statement by the Minister of Labor, Zoran Đorđević, who recently said, "Our policy is what our President, Aleksandar Vučić, described, and that is the policy of freedom, equality, and the fact that we are a country of free people." I will come to my conclusions now. So in this paper, I have explored in which way and at which moments in time the images of migrants are exploited by populism by zooming in on Serbia. So I would say that the image of the migrant here figures in a way as a flexible signifier, since it can be used in different and contradicting ways, depending on the particular aim and context of its employment. So to signify a range of claims and implications: actual Europeanness, the threatening Muslim other, national heroism, and so on. And I have argued that this flexibility is based on various historical transformations of migration patterns and agents in this regional context. So the notion of diaspora includes both ideologically loyal work migrants, young anti-nationalist migrants, and precarious irregular work migrants who rightfully feel betrayed by the populist regime. So the populist strategies of instrumentalizing migrants in a way navigate a delicate terrain and are marked by ambivalence at times, and at times show, even as the COVID-19 context exemplifies, a paradoxical strategy of stigmatizing members of the diaspora, even though being the ones crucial for the regime in terms of remittances, social cohesion, and votes, as they actually represent and embody the exportation of poverty and potential social unrest. Equally, an expression of ambivalence towards migrants, however, based on other historical patterns, and in spite of strong historically embedded Islamophobia, in populist discourses, Muslim migrants can be represented in a much more favorable humanitarian way as, for example, national migrants who are scapegoated in the COVID-19 context. So I would conclude by arguing that this not merely represents an inner paradox and discursive weakness of nationalist populism a la Vučić, but actually rather that the ambivalence and flexibility of the migrant-related populist discourse figures as a potential strength and enables this form of populism to demarcate itself both from the opposition and the ultra-right circles. So actually that's a kind of a pessimistic conclusion. And furthermore, as opposed to the Western European context, and this is a point I'm really interested in discussing, it's non-Islamophobia that figures as a prime nationalist populist discursive strategy in the Serbian context. Thank you. Stop sharing.
So thanks a lot, Jelena. And actually, thanks a lot to all the speakers because they help us to problematize the phenomenon of the migration in Western Balkans, trying to unpack some concepts, in my opinion. And now perhaps we will leave the floor to some questions. We have still some minutes, so we enjoy any question you want to ask to the speakers, online and on site.
You have to go to the microphone, please.
I have a few questions, starting with the last speaker. Thanks very much to all of you for the very rich and stimulating talks. Starting with the last speaker, I really appreciate the comparative angle you take between Serbian and Western Europe. And I fully agree with the point you make, if I understood it correctly, that the images of the good and bad migrants are not stable images. I'm a bit less convinced by the fact that in Western Europe these images are stable. And I mean, among the many examples we can raise is certainly the one of the, South Asian Sikh communities in Western Europe. The Sikh migrants, if we compare, for instance, UK and Italy, they have, since the 1980s, throughout the mid-2010, been like represented as the model community, both in terms of being work migrants as well as forced migrants, because they came out of exile from South Asia. But after the 9/11, they started to be strongly targeted as terrorists, also because of the appearance of their community. And so, I mean, I think this is a kind of example that applies in different ways to other communities, also about how unstable could be the bad or the positive or negative stereotyping of migrant communities also in Western Europe. So I would probably encourage to nuance a little bit this rather than, I mean, I really appreciate the comparative angle, but I would probably not frame it in terms of stability and instability, because that would be probably overlooking the heterogeneity within Western Europe. With respect to Drago's presentation, I'm very much interested about the angle on memory. I mean, you mentioned the fact that there is a lack of institutional memory of the Balkan War, which was not sufficient to support the assistance of new coming displaced population. So, and I was wondering, what about the collective and personal memories? So do they counterbalance the way the people actually relate to new migrants, or new forced migrants today? And then for Céline, I missed a part of your presentation, so I apologize if you have already touched this in your talk. But I was wondering to what extent the media strategy, which is based on threat and the criminalization of refugees, which is becoming hegemonic for different reasons through the media, to what extent can it be counterbalanced by a different iconographic narrative promoted by the civil society or the center-left parties? So, in a provoking way, how successful but also how keen are leftist civil society organizations and political parties in promoting a counter-narrative? Because if I look at Italy, where the migration and refugee discourse has been hegemonized by the right-wing parties and the populist right since the early 2000s, even before, for different political and media reasons. But when the left parties came into power, the center-left parties came into power, they haven't been any good in promoting an alternative discourse. So, and this also we can wonder for the civil society organizations who are active in the field, no doubt, but they're not.
I apologize. I ask you if you can
Sorry,
squeeze the
I've been
question.
too long. Thanks to all of you.
And I apologize with the speakers. We have just, they said we have still a couple of minutes, if it's right.
We have only one request online. What about the future outset, picture and proposition? So I ask if it's possible 1 minute.
We have a couple of minutes more,
2 minutes.
so we apologize. We ask you to answer rather quickly. Thanks.
So what?
Perhaps Drago, if you want to reply to the question.
Elena?
It's our turn. Okay. Yeah. Of course, this is a crucial question, and I'm really, really thankful for raising this point. And that's one of the crucial arguments that I'm struggling with. So I completely agree with you that there is a huge heterogeneity, and of course, in the West European context. But I would kind of throw the question back to you and ask you, how would you frame it, if not as less stability or ambivalence? So that's what I would be interested in terms of those differences that I'm trying to work out. And as far as I understood you, you agree with. So this would be a conceptual question we obviously don't have time to talk about, but thanks again for your question and your comment.
If I may just join in, yeah, very valid question about collective and personal memory, and it's quite vivid in let's say, communal kind of the attitudes on a societal level, and people are basically making comparisons with the Croats being forcibly displaced during the 1990s, or any displaced population of Bosnia or in Serbia, you know, and it is sensible in this kind of the societal attitudes. But my point was that on the institutional level, basically highly political structures haven't used that much of the either physical facilities or the knowledge and know-how of dealing with the displaced population back then in the 1990s, imposing it onto the newly arrival migrants in Croatia. Is it almost as if started anew? You know, now we are, you know, coming up with some new kind of the ideas and facilities and procedures. Not seeing those people coming as real refugees. Even on the symbolic, linguistic level, there's a preference by the state to call them asylum grantees rather than refugees, in order not to mix them with the refugees within or from Croatia back then in the 1990s.
We are really sorry, but we have to close because the time is up.
Yeah, and we still want to thank all the speakers and the participants, and we're sorry, but we run out of time, but we hope that you enjoyed the discussion and it was fruitful for us.
Thank
Thanks
you
a
so
lot,
much.
and
Thanks
bye.
a lot.
Thank you.